My name is Carlos. I'm a web developer based in New York, and today we're going to work on a project called Cake O'Clock from the Test-Driven Development course. Now, in order to complete this project, you should be familiar with JavaScript, know how certain functions work, the syntax of it. You should also know a little bit of Chai, which is the testing framework that we used in the previous exercises. You don't understand all the features of it, but just know the syntax and how we write actual some unit tests. And you should also know HTML and CSS. We're not going to be writing HTML and CSS, but we're going to be working with certain elements. So you should be able to understand how the wrappers are structured and how an HTML file works and some of the attributes for CSS. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump straight into the project. Okay, so if you come from the previous exercises, we were working on this application called the Cake Bar, which is basically an online ordering service that takes orders for pancakes and other types of cakes. So for this project, they're planning on expanding their online ordering service, and they need our help. To better plan pancake production, the Cake Bar needs to prompt online customers for a pickup time. So they're going to add a few new features and requirements, and we're going to be writing unit tests for these features. So let's see the requirements they want. One, they want orders that can only be served on the hour between 8 and noon. They also want the pickup time to be displayed in a 24-hour format with a colon between the hours and minutes. And lastly, they want the field in the order ticket to be labeled as pickup time with a colon there as well. Okay, and you'll see in your text editor as well, you have 4 files displayed for you. We have order.js, order test. We have what looks like an HTML file. And we have a little folder icon here. Now, you don't have to understand what exactly is contained in all these files. I might go over it a little bit. If you're more curious of how the application is structured, you can click on this folder icon and explore some of these directories here. For example, the package.json, this is where it has all our dependencies. These are the packages that we installed for the application. These are packages installed for developing purposes. Don't worry too much about this. We're going to work on mostly on one file here, which is users visits index test, where we'll be writing our unit test. So let's go ahead and get started with our first requirement. So for our first requirement, we want orders to only be served between 8 and 12. Now we're going to manually test this. And by manually testing, I mean interacting with the application as if you were a user and seeing if the requirement is fulfilled or not. So let's go ahead and start our server by typing npm start. And let's refresh our browser here. That should load our application. So we see Cake Bar, we see the form to place an order. We type in our name, pick a cake type. We add certain fillings of our choice and choose a size. And here we're going to focus our attention on the pickup time here. And then once we place an order, our order should be displayed here. Now I was messing around with this a little bit, so you might see a few names already placed in there. So let's manually test this. Let's pretend we're placing an order. I'm going to put my name, pick whatever fillings you want, whatever size. And let's see, we want only to be able to set a pickup time between 8 and 12. So this is a drop-down menu. And we can already see the problem here is that we have 1 o'clock listed. So this should either be deactivated or it should not be displayed as an option for the users. So it might be deactivated, I'm not sure. So let's go ahead and place an order. So let's see if it passes and it takes in the order. We know that this is actually a bug that needs to be fixed because we don't want orders to be placed past noon. Okay, so that's it for step 1. We're going to go ahead and start writing our first test in the following step. Okay, so in step 2, we're going to write a test for the first requirement. The structure of the test will look similar to what you've seen in the Y test lesson. If you haven't seen that, go ahead and take a quick look. You'll see some boilerplate code in our file here, which is user visits index test. And we're going to write our test in line 25. Now, before we start writing our test, I'm going to go ahead and expand this editor. And let's just take a quick look of what we have here. We have a large block with a describe kind of function here. And inside that describe, we have other small blocks that are called it. These it blocks here, these are our unit tests. We already see we have a few already typed out for us. And at the top, we're importing what looks like some object or function imported from the Chai library. and another one from the JSDOM library. And we have this helper function here at the top. I'm going to go over this quickly. But before that, in case you didn't know, I'm sure at this point you should know what Chai is. And Chai is simply a test-driven development assertion library, and we use it for Node and the browser, and we compare with other testing frameworks of our choosing. So more specifically, Chai is an assertion library, and it makes testing much easier by using assertion calls here. You can see actually in our unit test we have assert calls here with different kind of properties here. Dot equal is not the only one. We have include, not include, and there's a bunch of other ones you can actually find out in their documentation at chai.js.com. But one of the great things about Chai is that it's a very readable assertion library. And for these assertions, all we have to do is basically type in assert what we want to assert. We can assert equal to, not equal to, or include. And we're going to pass in 2 parameters here. You can actually pass in more options, but the required ones are 2. So the first one being what the actual value from our unit test results in. And the second one is what we expect it to return. So we'll go in a little bit more depth into this. In our unit test, we're going to be writing some code. And at the end of our unit test, we're going to do the assertion. So after all this code block is executed, the first parameter will be the value of what we want to expect, and the actual value from the code block. And the second will be what we expect, what we would like to return. And JSDOM just basically allows us to interact with our browser a lot more easier. We're going to do just a few calls. We're going to use it mostly with this function here, which I'm going to dive into right now. So let's look at that. In line 4, we have a function called parse text from HTML, and we have 2 parameters, HTML as string and a selector. Inside that, we have a variable called selected element, and that's set equal to a call for the JS function where we pass in HTML as a string, which is a parameter, and we call .querySelector, which is just a regular DOM call, to a selector we passed in when we call the function. Essentially, what this function is doing is basically looking into the context of an element here and grabbing its text value. So let's say we want to actually grab the value here. We can actually use this function to pass in all the HTML as a string, find out what selector we have for this tag specifically. It might be an ID, and then pass in that selector, and we get the text value from that after we, for example, maybe place an order. It's very handy because then we can use our asserts and set a variable equal to a function call from here and pass in HTML as a string that we're going to be parsing, and then a selector, and this function call would result in this specific value. Okay, so let's scroll a little further down and let's look at what this other code block means. So we already know that these single it blocks are basically our specific unit tests. But what is this describe block, which is what is contained on top of this it block? Describe is basically a way to logically group our unit tests together. So think of the context of what this specific unit test is. Now, we don't want to have a unit test all over our place that are doing separate things for different kind of context. Unit test specifically wants to test a very specific feature of the app or function of the app. We don't want to have something that is testing a bunch of things in chains of unit tests. That's called an integration test, but we're not doing that right now. So it makes sense to group all this unit test in the context it belongs to. So for this code block here, we have a description of what the context is. Whenever a user visits the index page, we want certain unit tests to be placed for that context. So we have another group here called to post an order. So there are several different things that will occur when a user visits an index page, and more specific unit tests will be placed under the group of to post an order. So in order to post an order, for example, the first unit test we have here is that the index page shows up with a blank order, and we see that unit test here. We're going to make the other unit test specific for this code block here, because we're working mostly with one page, which is a root page. So we want all these unit tests to belong to that specific context. Whenever a user visits an index page and tries to post an order, we want to test that it starts with a blank order, that you can only place orders outside of working hours, that the ticket is displaying the selected hour properly, and a few other things here that we have tested here. So let's look at how a unit test is structured. Now, you might have looked on the previous exercises already and seen how it's written, but you should think of this as a way as how a user would interact with a page. We want that to follow the step-by-step guide. So kind of guide your unit test from step one of landing on the unit page and what you're gonna have your user do throughout. And at the end, after you've done the whole interaction with the page, then you do your assertion call. So let's look at the first unit test. The first unit test is that it's testing that it starts with a blank order. So what will be the first thing we're going to do in the unit test? Well, we're going to land in our root page. Now, I don't have time to go through every single package we have installed for this application. So I'll go over this one quickly. Browser, that comes from a package called WebDriver.io. And what WebDriver does, it's basically lets us control the browser or application with very few lines of code. And this handy object here, the browser object, has a lot of properties that we can find very useful. So browser.url simply gets the URL of the browser here, which would be just the page. And there's other properties we can call in browser. We can simply call getText and pass in a selector here, and it will get information from the way this page is structured, the application is structured, and has information on the HTML elements. So we can simply pass an ID here. And if you actually look at your handlebars file, you should be able to dig into this a little bit and see what IDs are found. You'll see some classes for certain divs, and you'll see some other IDs. We have a bunch of IDs for the selecting the stack size here as well. Once we have the information from our main root page, we can actually start calling certain values, our assertion calls here. We can see that we want the assert equal to whatever information is grabbed from here, the actual value, and this is what we want it to return. This is the expected return value. So if we grab the browser.getText and we pass in the deliver to span selector, which is this, that should return an empty string. Same would be applied to the pick a cake type and add a filling. Now we can see manually here that when we load our browser, it is actually giving us empty information here. So we know that this test would be passing. Okay, that's enough for explaining a bunch of stuff. Let's go actually start coding here. So let's scroll down to line 25. And let's start by running our first unit test. So let's start by writing our first if statement here. Now, when we're writing this test cases, we're actually using the framework from Mocha, just in case you didn't know. So our first parameter here would be the name, the title of the test case we're going to be working with. So we're testing that our option, the drop-down menu down there, right over here, does not give us options for outside of working hours. So why don't we just call this does not provide options outside of working hours. From there, we're actually going to pass in a callback function. And inside this code block here, here's where we're going to go through the process of interacting with an app by doing certain calls, and at the end making assertions so that when we land at the end of our testing case, we can assert what is a result from it. So we know we don't want users to be able to place orders at 7 and at 1 or anytime before or after that. So let's just make some variables and store those hours. So let's make a variable called early hour, set that equal to 7. We're going to do the same for the late hour as well. Okay, so next step is basically landing on the main page. So we're going to use the same call we used on line 16, browser.url, and pass in the root page. From there, we want to grab all the information from the whole application, because we're going to be finding out what is contained in this drop-down menu. We want to make sure as our test case basically grabs information from this drop-down menu and ensures that the hour 7 or 1 o'clock is not included in this drop-down menu. So we can parse all the HTML by simply calling get HTML on the browser object. And let's just store that in a variable called HTML. So let's call that const HTML, set that equal to browser, this handy property call right here, get HTML, and then we pass under what tags, under what wrappers we want the information. We don't need the head, we just need the body basically. So we can just pass in body, that will grab all the HTML from that, from the main page. And then we need to basically use a function we had over here from our boilerplate code. And now that we have our HTML as a string, we can pass in the selector, which would be the ID found for this specific drop-down menu. And then we have the text contained in that element. So let's go ahead and store that parsed HTML in a variable as well. We can call that parsed HTML. Set that equal to parse text from HTML. And then here was where we pass in first the HTML as a string and the selector we want. So we already have the HTML text, which we have labeled as HTML named variable, and the selector we want. Now, I already know because I already took a look here, but if you scroll down here, you should see a selector for this drop-down menu here. We can see choose a size. Let me try to find it here for you guys. And here we go. This is the selector. This wrapper select has the ID of select pickup. And inside that select element, we have a bunch of options, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and then the 1 o'clock here. So we know we want to grab the information from that specific selector. So let's go ahead and pass in that selector. We'll call it select pick up. Perfect. And after this, we actually, since we already have the information from the select pickup, we can call our assertions. So just remember, we're using Mocha to write this unit test, and we're using the Chai assertion library. So these asserts are grabbed directly from Chai. So what are we going to call? We're going to call not include, because we want to make sure that these variables here, 7 and 13, are not included in this drop-down menu. So we're going to pass in our parsed HTML, which is the actual values that we grab and what we expected to return. So we're going to simply pass in early hour. And we also want to make sure that it does not include the late hour. So parsed HTML, late hour. Now go ahead and save that. And I'm typing these values into variables just to make it a little bit more dynamic. Let's say the company changes their working hours to 6 to noon or 6 to 11 or whatever. We can essentially just change the values here as opposed to shifting the values in the assertion calls. It would be easier to use so that, for example, another developer works on this project, he will know what to change specifically here since it's very descriptive. Also, why it's important to be very specific as to what the title of these test cases are. If you type something ambiguous, then it can be confusing for other users. So make sure you're actually detailed in what the test case is actually testing. Okay, great. So that's it for step number 2. Let's go on to the third step. So now we're going to kill the server here. And we're going to run our testing suite by running npm test. Now, we're expecting this test to actually fail since we already know that our 1 o'clock is in this drop-down menu. Now, this might take a little minute to load, so don't panic. It's usually when there's a lot of tests that are running already. So here, I'll bring this up a little more. Now you can see what the test failed, and you can see a description of why it failed. So our expected value, which is the information we grabbed from the parsed HTML, these are all the values in our drop-down menu, and we set it to not include 13, but it included it, which is right here, the last one. So therefore, our test failed, which makes sense for us. So now we have to actually go ahead and debug it first afterwards, and then we can actually run our test and see it pass. So this is kind of like the flow of how test-driven development works. You write a test, you see it fail, you write your code, and you run the test again and make sure it passes. So let's go ahead and move on to step number 4, where we're actually going to debug this. I'm going to bring my editor out again. And in step 4, let me check these guys off again. In step 4, we have any information here. We already know that in our index.handlebar file in line 110, there is the error. Now, in case you didn't know what handlebars is, this is simply a templating engine. It very much looks like HTML, but it also has a way to embed JavaScript information here. There's not much JavaScript in the actual index page here. You see it here at the bottom. This is information grabbed from the order after it's placed. So these curly brackets basically mean it's reading some JavaScript information. So in line of 110, we have basically our drop-down, our selections for that drop-down menu. And we see that one of the options is 1 o'clock. So all we need to do is simply remove that line. Go ahead and save this again. And that's it for debugging. Pretty simple debugging issue there. So let's go on and move on to step number 5. And if you'd like to double check, you can simply run your test read again with npm test. And now this test we've just wrote should be passing. Give it a second, wait for the output. And then we have 7 passing tests. And we see the test description here for a test kit does not provide options that said working hours passed. Okay, awesome. So now we can move on to the next requirement. I'm going to minimize this a little bit. And we're going to do a manual test here. So I'm going to bring our server back and start it again. So let's go ahead and start it. So for the requirement 2, we want to manually test that the pickup time is displayed in the proper format. So let's go ahead and refresh our browser and place another order and see that the output at the bottom is displayed properly. So place in whatever information you'd like. Let's make sure we place an order for the hour 8. It comes out properly with a colon in there. Let's try 9 o'clock now. You can see why it's the usefulness of writing tests. This would be all automated, so we don't have to manually test every single feature here. For this case, we're just going to try out specific hours so we see what we're getting. So we tried for 9 o'clock, and we see that this test is, this shouldn't be outputted in this format. We should have a colon with 2 zeros after that. So we're going to have to write a test for this, debug that, and make sure the test passes. So let's go ahead and move on to step 6. So for this test, we're going to go to line 28. It's a little lower now since we actually wrote another tester. It's around line 38 for you. And we're going to write this test to make sure that it displays the selected hour properly. Now we're going to do the same pattern we've been doing for the other test. We're going to write the description of our test case, and we want to make sure it displays the selected hour. Go ahead and pass in callback function here. And now in our code block, we're going to go through the motions of how a user would interact with the page. Before that, let's just store a variable with the hour that is not being displayed properly here. We want the hour to be displayed as 9:00. So let's make a variable and set it to a string that has the proper format. After that, what happens, we're going to land in our index page. So let's go ahead and get the information from that index page with / here with browser URL. So the next step, as if you were a user, we'd actually select an hour, whichever hour. In this case, we'll click on 9, and then submit an order. And then we can grab the information from here and call our search and call. So how do we do this? Well, there's a handy function for browser called select by visible text, where we can actually manually place the time for our order and pass in a selector as well. So we can do that by calling select by visible text on the browser object. So browser.select by visible Next, here we pass in the ID, the selector we want. For this case, it would be what we had earlier, which is select pickup. And then we pass in the value we want, which would be this hour here. So let's go ahead and pass in select pickup, capital U, and we'll pass in our hour. Now we're not doing exactly a not include. We want to make sure that whatever we select in here, the value returned is the value that we expect it to. So after we select the pickup order, what do? We click on this button, which is, this one has an ID. I already know it has an ID called submit dash order. So we're going to click on this and then redirect our user to the main page, and then we can grab the value that's found here at the bottom. So let's go ahead and do browser. There's another function, you guessed it, called click. We pass in the selector we want. It's not select pickup, sorry, it's submit order. And we redirect the user to the landing page again. Once we're there, the information at the bottom is displayed, and we can simply call getText on our browser object to get that information. So we can now call our assert, make our assert call with include, and the information grabbed from the pickup, hash pickup from this time, and we want to make sure that it equals this hour as well. So if you select, if we put in the 9 o'clock hour in our submitting of the order, we click the button and we redirect there. What we want this value right over here to be, we want it to be the same as the hour we placed. So let's go ahead and pass in getText, pass in the ID or the selector that we are looking into. Now it's called pickup. If you dig into your handles bar file and go all the way at the bottom, you'll see that this header here has the pickup time displayed. So we know that it's pickup. Let me scroll back down right over here. So this is the actual value grabbed from the file after the order is placed. And what we expect it to return is the same format. So 9:00. That's the expected return. So we should know that this is going to fail because at the moment we're not getting 9:00, we're just getting the number 9. Go ahead and save this. And that concludes it for step 6. So now we're actually going to kill the server here. And we're going to run our test suite again. So run npm test. Might take a second since it's running all the other tests. Bring this up a little bit more. And we can see a little information on what test failed. So we see that the text that we grabbed from that selector, which is drop-off time :9, does not include the expected hour we wanted to, 9:00. So as we know this test was going to fail, we can now move on to step number 8, where we're actually going to debug the problem. I'm going to bring this back down a little bit more, and let's continue to step number 8. So once again, the description of the step gives us handy information. We know that it's in handlebars around line 105. Now we deleted a line before, so it might be a different line, but let's scroll down around that area. Okay, so we see it's actually, it is line 105. Okay, so we see the problem here. They want us to replace the current line with this line. Now, if you're curious why this is happening, well, when we place an order on this form, we're making a post request and it's sending information to our server, and that information is being stored in our database here. You can see how the database is set up for an order on the order.js file. You don't have to understand every single thing from this, but the way this is working is basically grabbing the values from the HTML. So if you look down back in line 105, you'll see that each of these options have a value attribute. Now, when we place the post request, it's grabbing these values and storing them in the database. So we see the format is being stored wrong over here. We see that the value is actually just 9 when it should be 9:00. So when we make the post request, this value is being stored. So now that it's being stored as 9:00, our test should be passing. So go ahead and save that, and let's move on to the next requirement. You can go ahead and run your test suite again to make sure it's passing. Again, it might take a second to load. And there we go. We have our other test passing now. Okay, perfect. So now let's start our server again. In step 8, we're going to manually test that the new field in the order ticket is labeled as pickup time. So go ahead and start the server. Refresh your browser. Now the order ticket is this ticket here at the bottom, and we want the drop-off time to actually be labeled as pickup time. So we don't really have to place an order. We can already see that this label is wrong. This line here should say pickup time instead of drop-off time. So let's go on and start writing our test for this in step 10. Okay, let's move back to our file for user visits index test, and we're going to write our test below the previous one, right here in line 50. We're going to follow the same pattern we did with the other test. Let's start with an it block here, and we're going to write the description for labels, the pickup or correctly. I'm having a bad typing day today, guys. We'll pass in the callback function, and inside this block is the same as what we've been doing. We're going to store a variable with the string that we actually want the label to be read as the format. So let's make our variable called label, set it equal to pick up time. Make sure you add the colon there. And now let's go through the process of how we're going to interact with the page. This is actually pretty small test code because we don't need to actually submit any orders. All we need to do is land in the landing page. And then from there, we can simply do what we did in the first test, which we just look directly into this specific tag. Before that, let's actually use our handy function. So let's get all the information, the HTML found in the body. Let's do that and store that in a variable called HTML, like we already did. Browser.getHTML. And grab it from the whole body tags. And then we're going to parse that HTML to grab information from this selector here. So we're going to do that with our handy function called parse text from HTML. Let's store that in a variable called parsed HTML, and we're going to call the function parse text from HTML. Pass in our HTML information. Pass in the selector. Make sure you add the quotation marks. Pick up. And now we can actually just do our assertions. So we want to make sure that this expected value equals the actual one. So we can simply call include on the assertion. So the parsed HTML is the actual value we got, and we are expecting it to return that label variable, which is pickup time. We know this is going to fail because what's found in this selector, it actually says drop off time. So go ahead and save this. And that's it for step number 10. Apologies, I got disconnected for a second. So let's start out on step 11 here. Now that we actually written the test, we can go ahead and kill our server and run our test suite to see it fail. So go ahead, kill the server, type in npm test, and then run it. As you expect, it might take a little bit to actually load. We should see the test we just wrote to fail. And here we go. We have one failing test. All the other tests are passing. We see a description of the test case. The test to post an order labels the pickup correctly. It expected drop-off time to include pickup time, which it does not. So now we have to actually go ahead and debug that. So let's go ahead and move on to step 12. Okay, in step 12, we're going to fix the error. And right over here, we are told it's on line 137 of our handlebars file. And all the way at the bottom, we see right over here in our H2 header, we have drop-off time when it should actually be pickup time. see right over here. Save the file. Perfect. That's it for step 12. And for our final step, we're just going to run our test suite again. And now we should have all tests passing. Give it a second to load. And there we go. We have all our tests passing. We see a little bit. So here we have basically our context from the describe block, user visit index. And there we have another describe block called to post an order. And we have all these unit tests written there. Perfect. This concludes our project for testing with Chai and Mocha. Now, this is basically the flow of test-driven development. Usually you'd write a test, you see it fail, then you write some code or modify the code you have written, and then you run the test and see it fail. So we saw how inefficient manually testing each feature of the app would be. We would have to actually test for every single thing. Let's say we want to test maybe the fillings are working properly. So let me run the server again. Let's say we want to test all the fillings are working properly. You'd actually have to type in the fillings one by one to actually make sure they're working. Instead of doing that, we could actually just write a test that ensures that whenever we click filling, the displayed pancake, the filling is actually displayed properly. Manually testing is not an efficient way, even though some companies actually still do that. So one other thing you might not realize, but in this way, you're actually thinking through your requirements and design of the app and how it should work before you even actually start writing your functional code. So your testing should be how you want the app to work and write that feature, make sure you write the test, and then you can actually start coding that feature itself. So it's more of an organizational tool as well. It helps you structure your code and application properly. Now, I suggest you guys go to chai.js.com to look at the assertion library they include and investigate a little bit more on the packages. Here on the package.json file, if you click on that folder icon, you'll see some of the packages we installed. These are dependencies. These are all the dependencies we installed. And we have dev dependencies. Dev dependencies are simply packages we installed for development purposes. Check out Chai, check out the documentation of Mocha and WebDriver.io. You don't have to understand how everything works, but it's good to have a sort of idea of what is contained in certain objects. But anyway, that concludes our project for the day. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.